Okay. All right, I'm hoping this works better now. Can you guys hear? Can you put in chat if you can hear me now? All right, great. I'm Tamarine Cornelius. Welcome to Wisconsin Budget 101. I'm from the Wisconsin Budget Project, and we are a nonprofit organization that focuses on tax and budget issues and how those issues affect people in Wisconsin. And we're an initiative of Wisconsin Council on Children and Families. So let's get started. So we'll start off by talking about why the state budget matters and the process by which the state budget gets passed and the timeline and who's involved in that. We'll also talk about where the state gets its revenue and how the state spends that revenue. And then we'll also talk about ways to get involved and how you can find out more about the state budget process. So the first part is, why is the state budget important? And I want to emphasize this because the state budget is kind of boring, it's hard to understand, it's long, so why do we have to pay attention to it? Well, it sets the priorities, the tax and spending priorities for the next 2 years. So every time you drive on a road, or you send your child to school, or turn on the water, or make a purchase, you're affected by decisions made in the state budget. And those decisions aren't restricted to only at the state level, because for local governments, a big chunk of the revenue that they get comes from the state, and the other revenue that they use, the state sets parameters on how they can raise that revenue. So the state budget has a significant effect on local governments as well. And the state budget isn't just only about fiscal decisions. It's the one piece of legislation that has to be passed. So what that means is that lawmakers use it as a vehicle for all sorts of non-fiscal policy items, get sort of loaded up with policy items. So the bottom line is that the Wisconsin budget is a way of balancing our priorities in terms of taxes and spending, and also policy decisions. Wisconsin has a 2-year budget, and it runs from July of the odd number year through June of the following odd number year. So we're coming up on a budget that's going to run from July 2017 through June 2019. The first step in that budget happens in the odd number years in the fall and winter, when state agencies give their budget requests to the governor. So state agencies, that's agencies like the Department of Natural Resources, or the Department of Health Services, or the Department of Public Inspection. They give information to the governor about how much they would like to see in the budget. The governor then takes those recommendations under advisement and then issues his own version of the budget. And that is sometimes called the executive budget. And that is what the governor is going to be releasing tomorrow. We're not going to talk about it very much in this presentation, because we're not going to talk about all in this presentation, because he's been releasing little bits and pieces of it as we go, and without the full context, it's hard to know what the budget is going to mean for Wisconsin. So tomorrow, we'll be patient. Tomorrow we'll know a whole lot more about that. So once the governor issues his budget, which is typically in February, then the budget goes to the state's, the legislature's budget committee, which is called the Committee on Joint Finance, or the Joint Finance Committee, or sometimes just Joint Finance, or JFC. And this budget committee has both senators and representatives, and it's dominated by lawmakers from the majority party, but it has lawmakers from the minority party on it as well. And the Joint Finance Committee holds hearings around the state and makes decisions about the budget. And most of the action in the Joint Finance Committee happens in May of the odd number year. After the budget leaves the Joint Finance Committee, it needs to be passed by both houses of the legislature, go to the governor for his signature, and any vetoes. But right now, Republicans control the governor's office and the state senate and the state assembly. So they are probably going to hash out the major differences in joint finance before the budget leaves joint finance. So the version of the budget that leaves the Joint Finance Committee will probably be pretty similar to the final result. There'll be small changes, but it's likely that what comes out of joint finance will be very similar to what's actually signed. And the governor signs the budget after everything's been approved. In some states, if the budget is passed in time for the new fiscal year to start, then state government shuts down or partly shuts down. That's not the that doesn't happen in Wisconsin. If the new budget isn't in place in time for the new fiscal year to start, we just keep the previous year's tax and spending levels. So we have a little slower pace, and usually the governor signs the new budget bill in July or maybe August. So does Wisconsin have a balanced budget? The state constitution requires Wisconsin to pass a balanced budget in that estimated revenues are enough to cover the estimated spending. So by that definition, yes, Wisconsin has a balanced budget. But there are some other ways to measure the degree to which Wisconsin is meeting its financial obligations. And sometimes over the course of a biennium, that 2-year budget period, economic conditions fluctuate and may deteriorate to the point where there is no longer enough revenue to meet estimated spending. And if that's the case, then the governor can make small adjustments to bring those two back into balance. But if bigger adjustments are made, then the legislature needs to pass a budget repair bill. Another way of assessing the potential gap between revenues and spending is at the beginning of the budget process, taking the total amount of budget requests submitted by state agencies and then comparing that to the amount of revenue that the state is expected to have over the next 2 years. And typically, the budget requests submitted by agencies add up to more than the state is estimated to have over the next 2 years in revenue. Sometimes it's much more. And another way of assessing the degree to which revenues and spending match up is to compare ongoing revenues with ongoing spending. Lawmakers sometimes use one-time revenues to cover ongoing spending. And revenues are sometimes one-time, but spending almost never is. Or lawmakers can make future budgets harder by pushing a payment off into the next fiscal year and doubling up in the future. Or they might phase in a tax cut over several years, reducing revenues in the future, and almost make it harder to balance revenue and spending in future budgets. All right, next up, how Wisconsin, various sources of revenue in the Wisconsin budget. Every year, Wisconsin takes in and spends about $35 billion a year, but only about half of that is state tax money. So I'm going to touch on 4 main types of revenue in a budget, each of which come from slightly different sources and can be used for slightly different things. The biggest chunk is general purpose revenue, also called GPR, and that's about 45% of the revenue in the budget. And this is mostly tax money. It can be used for anything, great deal of flexibility, and it's typically the source that underwrites general state operations. I'm to come back and talk a little bit more about GPR and what goes into GPR after I touch on the other sources of revenue. All right, the second biggest pot of money in the state budget is federal dollars. That's just under a third of the revenue in the budget. Federal revenue typically comes with strings attached. The federal government usually requires the state to spend that money for a specific purpose or program. And the other two sources of revenue that I want to touch on are program revenue. That is basically user fees and purpose that is closely related to the way that the revenue is generated. And the UW tuition is included in that. And then the segregated revenue, that's about 10% of the total revenue in the budget. And segregated revenue is money from a specific source that is put into a separate fund and then used for a certain specified purpose, or at least that's the theory. The best example of that is the gas tax, which is put into the state's transportation fund and then used for highway construction repair. Okay, so going back to GPR again, so that's general purpose revenue, and it's basically tax money and multiple source of revenue. Where does that money come from? Well, mostly tax money, and about half of it is from the individual income tax. About a third of it is from the tax. And then the other two significant sources of GPR are the corporate income tax and excise taxes. That is it's cigarette taxes and other taxes like that. And then there's a couple other minor sources of GPR. Okay, so who is paying these taxes? Well, everybody in Wisconsin pays taxes. But if we dig deeper, we can see some differences in terms of who pays taxes by the income levels. So in Wisconsin, the people with the very highest incomes pay a smaller share of their income in state and local taxes than do, on average, than do people in other income groups. That's true in Wisconsin. It's true in almost every other state as well, so it's not particular to just Wisconsin. So you can see by this chart here, taxpayers in Wisconsin in the top 1%. So those are taxpayers with incomes of about $400,000 and above, pay on average 6.2% of their income in state and local taxes. And in comparison, taxpayers in the lowest income group, so those would be taxpayers who earn less than $22,000, pay 8.9% of their income in state and local taxes. The Wisconsin's income tax and sales tax have different properties in terms of who pays them. The sales tax in Wisconsin is regressive, which means that people with lower incomes typically pay a higher share of their income in that tax. So you can see in this chart, we see that taxpayers in the lowest 20% pay 6% of their income in sales and excise taxes, compared to 0.8% for people in the top 1%. The pattern is flipped for the income tax. People with the lowest incomes in Wisconsin essentially pay no income tax. People with the highest incomes pay a much higher share of their income in the income tax. Some states have made changes where they cut the income tax and then increase the sales tax to make up for the lost revenue. Kansas, for example, has done that. When you cut the income tax and raise the sales tax, you shift the responsibility for paying taxes away from people with high incomes onto people with lower incomes, and typically wind up giving people with high incomes a big tax cut, and people with low incomes oftentimes have a tax increase. Okay, this chart shows what the state spends its GPR on. So GPR is the most flexible source of revenue, and most of the other sources of revenue are earmarked for specific purposes, so we're going to focus on GPR here. The single biggest category of GPR spending is K-12 education in Wisconsin. That's just over a third of total GPR spending goes for schools. In Wisconsin, schools are financed through a combination of state aid and also local property taxes, and a few other small sources. The next biggest category of GPR spending is medical assistance, which includes Badger Care, and that provides health insurance to people with low income. The state's correction system and the UW system are the next two biggest programs in GPR spending, with the state spending a little more GPR on corrections than it does on the UW system. Those four programs, K-12 education, medical assistance, corrections, and the UW system, make up about 2/3 of GPR spending in Wisconsin. And those programs and other programs, in those programs, costs increase from year to year, even if no new services are being added typically, because of factors like inflation or population growth and healthcare costs going up. So if you fund these programs and other programs at the same level from one year to the next without accounting for these increasing costs, typically that requires a reduction in services. So this is what people mean when they say flat funding is a cut. Typically have to reduce services to get flat. Okay, now that you're all up to speed on the budget, what are some ways to get involved and make sure that your voice is heard? Well, you can call your state lawmaker. They want to hear from you. That deer is supposed to be like they're all ears. They're all ears and like constituent. If you are not sure how to contact your legislator, you can go to that website there. And that website has maps and lets you see what district you're in. Or you can enter your snail mail address, and then it returns who your state senator is and who your state representative is. And you can find your way to that link just by Googling who is my Wisconsin legislator. Contacting your legislator will double if they're on the Joint Finance Committee. Here, the senators on the Joint Finance Committee and the representatives on the Joint Finance Committee, and if one of those is in your district, then you should definitely make sure that they know what your priorities are in the budget. The Joint Finance Committee has hearings around the state, and people can testify in front of the Joint Finance Committee. Not everybody who wants to testify is able to testify because of time constraints, but you can always submit written testimony to the Joint Finance Committee as well. And you should consider connecting with an advocacy group. There may be an advocacy group out there that is already working to bring about the change that you're interested in, and you could plug into the advocacy group and add your voice to theirs. Or if you can't find the advocacy group that reflects your priorities, then you can start your own. And that's not as far-fetched of a step as it might seem. One of the big advocacy success stories in recent years has been the rise of in school districts around the state in places like Spooner and Whitewater, and there's a big one in Wauwatosa, and there's one in Eau Claire. And these parent groups have communicated to their legislator that they value public education and they want to make sure that their legislators vote in a way that the schools get the resources they need to continue giving Wisconsin school children a great public education. Some of those groups started with something as small as a Facebook page. So if you're in a school district and you don't have one of these groups, you could start one of those, and those have been very successful in turning back some of the worst public education cuts and possibly getting new resources. As for how to keep up to date with what's going on, I'm going to plug our own website, right, with the WisconsinBudgetProject.org. So we have information on there, and we'll have more information on there once the governor releases his version of the budget. So you can check the website for that. And there's also a budget toolkit on our website, and that budget toolkit includes a lot of the same information that was in this presentation. On our website, you can sign up to receive emails about budget issues. We typically send out emails once a week or maybe once every 2 weeks. And then you can also sign up to get our blog posts delivered via email on our website. And then, of course, you can follow us on social media on Facebook and Twitter. As far as following sort of in real time what's going on in the budget, or nearly real time, the Risk Politics budget blog is a good source for that because they have a lot of updates and keep current with what's going on. Another source that might be helpful in a similar way is the Wheeler Report, which has press releases from legislators and advocacy groups, also has newspaper articles, things like that, that can keep you abreast with what's going on in the budget process. And I would like to put in a plug for the Wisconsin Budget for All, to check that out. This is it's an initiative that pushes for investments in Wisconsin's health and public schools and workforce in a way that helps communities thrive. And it advocates for a budget that works for everyone and not just a select few. It's backed by a wide array of advocacy groups, including Wisconsin Council on Children and Families. And you can find it on Facebook at the Wisconsin Budget for All. That concludes Wisconsin Budget 101. If you have any additional questions, you can ask them in chat. We'll get to some of those. If not, we might be able to follow up. And thanks for watching. We plan to have a recorded version of this webinar on our website. And I'll take a look at the questions and be back with you in a minute. Okay, good. One question was about this. Why is this chart for the non-elderly? And that is because their tax systems are typically different with Social Security, and so oftentimes when you look at tax patterns, you include non-elderly people because their tax situation is typically different enough from other people's patterns that it makes it harder to see the overarching patterns. So I have two questions here that I'm not going to answer because they, I would answer them best if I did a little bit of research and looked up some figures, and off the top of my head, I don't think would be a good way to address your question. One about the manufacturing and agriculture credit. and how much that is as a percentage of the budget. So just a brief outline for that credit. Well, I'll talk a little bit about that. That is a credit that goes to manufacturers and to much lesser degree farmers, and that virtually eliminates their need to pay income taxes. It's been an issue because it's reducing state revenue by a lot more than originally anticipated. It's going to be up to about $300 million tax cut in each of the next 2 years. I think it's actually slightly above that. And it winds up mostly in the pockets of taxpayers with extremely high incomes. So the question is, how much is this credit as a percentage of this total budget? So it's about $300 million, and off the top of my head, I don't know what that is as a percentage of the total budget. How much of this credit goes to farmers making less than $75,000 a year? Only about 9% of it goes to farmers at all, and then it's very slanted in terms of income. So while I don't know the $75,000 amount, I anticipate it would be a very small figure. There's 2 gap questions that I'm going to hold off on.
So a follow-up.
Okay. All right.
Is there a list of?
Oh, is there a list of who's getting it?
Yeah.
No. That's easy. And then there's a question here about gap, and I think what I'll do is there's my email there, and the person who asked that, why don't we talk via email so that I can be better prepared to answer your question. You can send me an email. Thanks for your question. Oh, we have his email. We know who you are.
Yeah.
All right. I'll follow up with you, Joe, via email. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay. All right. Thank you, everyone, for your interest in this webinar, and we may try another one soon, so we'll keep you updated. Thanks.